right. So we just have one person right now. I'll wait a few minutes and let people sign on. I actually have a water bottle for this lecture, so my voice won't be too terrible. Trying to think about, there's not a lot of housekeeping for today. Really just talking to the one person, so we'll see. Man, if people don't sign on, I might just be giving a lecture to one person. That's what they call good teacher-student ratio. Like programs are they advertise that. So maybe whoever that is that's watching gets their own lecture. All right. All right, 2 people watching now. That is 2 people watching now. That is 100% increase. All right, well, I'm going to get going and people can sign on. But so reminder about today. Remember, the homework is 2 out of the 3. Other than that, today is the last day for Principles of Animation. So, very excited about doing these. These are fun ones. I actually dug into some of my old stuff, stuff where I'm like, why am I showing people this? This is terrible because it's 9 years old. But stuff that I think actually works, even if my 3D modeling has gotten better. Even though I don't do as much modeling as I used to, just because I work on very different games than I used to. But I've got some old 3D models in here just for old time's sake, I guess. But we'll see what those are and what they have to do with these principles. So today's principles are timing, exaggeration, solid drawing, and appeal. And again, there's that handy dandy image that comes from a company in Cleveland. I mentioned that both for local pride, but also because check that company out. If they're ever hiring, wink wink hint hint. So let's get to it. And I'm gonna do something a little bit different. No worries, hello. I'm going to do something a little bit different with some of these because we've actually covered 2 of them pretty well in past lectures. And I'll point out the things we have covered. And even reiterate some of them. But yay, 3 people now. But I think this gives a good opportunity to address some things that people had questions about, which I thought were very good questions. And so with having this space in the lecture for ideas that we've already covered, we actually have some time to do deep dives on I don't know, I guess extra material. Extra is the wrong word, but nuances. So the first thing we're going to talk about is timing. And timing is really simple. Timing is how long does an action take. And the principles of timing are more drawings equals slower action, and fewer drawings equals faster action. That's pretty simple. We've had 2 lectures where we've talked about timing. The first was the one where we talked about timing and spacing. The other was the one where we talked about X sheets. Now, and I realize that those things are still like kind of mysterious and confusing. But for both the X sheets and the timing itself, the thing I want people to understand is that like this is a practice, like trial and error process. And, you know, one thing that I emphasized to the students in the last lecture, and I'm going to emphasize again, because there was this really great question about, really great discussion about timing that we had, which is pretty miraculous considering that I'm staring at a YouTube chat window. But the discussion that we had was whether, basically it seemed like people were not in love with X sheets. And I get that because they're, like, again, tax forms for comedy, as the one podcast the guy from Cartoon Network tells us. But the thing about... So the discussion was, somebody asked, is there a way to perfectly plan for timing? And the answer is X sheets, in between charts, storyboarding. And the discussion really got into, because somebody was like, well, I just like to get in there and experiment till it's the way I like it. And there's going to be a bit of that, don't get me wrong. Like, and this GIF I chose specifically for this slide because of that. There's a lot of like, to walk you through the workflow of the specific set of drawings you're seeing now, because I'm still working on them. I planned these out with like a small storyboard, and, you know, got the storyboard pieces into Blender as, you know, as keyframes, and then looked at the timing of them and added frames at the beginning and the end for slow in, slow out. And then, you know, there's little additions like the thing with the flags at the end. We want it to be a sad little like burr, 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 like when he, you know, the flags pop up. But making this animation went super fast. And the reason it went super fast is because I took the planning steps beforehand of like drawing it out and working on timing and things like that, and then brought it into Blender. If I had not done that, there'd be significant time spent doing drawings, and, you know, that trial and error of drawing trial and error would be like a time sink versus like trial and error of, you know, let me take this frame and move it over here. You know, that's a, you know, click drag versus like, let me draw these 7 drawings, which can take forever. So, you know, one of the things we talked about was, when you think about your career, like right now, like think about the scope of a career. So, you know, you're 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 years old right now. You know, let's assume a career ends at like 65, 70 or something like that. You know, we're all millennials and Gen Zers in here. We may never retire. That's a different discussion. But, you know, imagine your career is going to take you over several decades. You've been doing this for, what, 3 months? If it's the entire class, maybe 1.5 months since we've actually done some of these concepts for X sheets and timing. The point I'm getting at, and that I got at earlier, was it may seem intuitive right now to just dive in, but you actually waste more time when you dive in without a plan, because while it seems fast to do stuff with you know, the actual work, you know, and the planning feels like a chore, the planning makes the work go faster. So, you know, the discussion I thought was really good, and I wanted to like catch you all up. Planning is super important when it comes to timing. There is always going to be trial and error, but even a planning mechanism that gets you to 60% planned or 60% of things right, uh, even if it's not 100% of things right, you're still 60% along than you were if you'd done no planning, if that makes sense. So, the tools of planning out timing are all the ones we've discussed so far. You're still going to get trial and error, and that's okay. So we've covered timing, and let me know if there are any thoughts or questions about that whole thing. I'd love to hear your take on it, what you're feeling as you learn this. But again, you're very early on, and if you're having trouble with some of these principles, or you're feeling that you're not great at them yet, you've been doing this for a matter of months rather than a matter of years. And even me, who's been working with animation timing, but then having to relearn some of it because my experience has always been more in 3D than 2D. I'm very much a person who still tinkers and experiments. It's that my tinkering and experimenting is less because I plan, and it's almost I say this as a person who's been around the block a few times that planning is good, but as a 20-year-old I would have been no, screw it, I'm going to jump in. But now I'm all about planning, so it's really something that comes with age. But yeah, let me know what you think about that. The point I'm going to get to, though, which is let's take this from a different perspective. So I was asked a few weeks ago, and I thought it was really insightful question. So I wanted to maybe devote some lecture time. And now that since we've covered timing so well, I thought this would be a great opportunity to talk about animation in games and how that is different from your traditional animation. And there's a lot of ways that it's similar. This is one of the things that I always really want students to understand in our program, because I think there's a artificial segregation that happens where students will be I'm here for animation and I want to do animation, and they sort of discount the possibility that, and this isn't on the animation students, I think the game students do this too. They're I'm doing games and I'm only ever doing this type of game. And then some people do face plants. That's my job. How's my angle looking? Fine. So that's the second time that's happened today. Each class gets one of those. So the truth is these fields are so blended that it's very possible that somebody who says I'm going to be an animator is going to do animation for a game, and then there's a very huge possibility that somebody who's a game person is going to totally get a job doing 3D animation for a graphics company or something, even if it's not explicitly game development, right? So you have the same set of skills. You might learn the theory and knowledge of one side or the other, or focus on that, but you have this pool of skills. But there are differences adapting for different release contexts, we'll call them. And to demonstrate that, I actually want to pull back from Nemo for a short second, which has been the source of so many of our examples, and go to another game that I've been kind of tinkering on weekends, which is called Kudzu. It's a Zelda Metroid, it's a Zeldaroid, which sounds like something you need a cream for. So it's a terrible genre title. But, it's a Zelda Metroid-ish type game that I'm making using a game engine called GB Studio. Now, I'm really liking this engine, not because It's a good engine. I don't. It's not that the software is like great or anything, but I like it for a few reasons. One is that it launches to Game Boy, so it makes Game Boy ROMs. So if I wanted to, I could get a cartridge flasher and flash it onto like an actual Game Boy cartridge and play it on my original Game Boy, which would look really weird because one of its one of its rows of LCD pixels is dead. So maybe I'll play it on my Game Boy Pocket or Color. But I can play it on a real Game Boy. That's kind of cool. And what I love about this is that it's less because I'm a fan of the Game Boy, though I loved that console. It's so good. But in reality, what's really cool about it is that it shares something that I really like about this other engine, Pico 8, which is that it has really hard limitations. And those really hard limitations really squeeze a lot of creativity out of you because... And actually, me and your other instructors have talked a lot about this, of like the through line of game engines that we teach you throughout your academic career. Right now, and the way you've done it, is the first one we really have you use is Unity. And Unity and Unreal are kind of like, those are the high-end middleware ones. And I say middleware because, like, if you're going to go work at EA or Ubisoft or Blizzard or somebody, they mostly just like roll their own engine. But any bigger studio is or like for most commercial products, it's usually Unity or Unreal. I think Unity has like a little more market share. But those are like dream machines. Those are the things you use to make dreams come true. Basically, you have almost no limitations except for the limitations of your chosen hardware that you're launching to. So, if you're making a Switch game, you got to make it run on Switch. But if you're making PC, like the sky's the limit, unless then you're porting to Switch, then it's that like 20 gigabyte download for half the game situation, which I hate. All of this is to say that learning to make for smaller things or older things is kind of an art. And that's what I love about these engines is that, like, so if we go to the bottom of this screenshot here, and I saw that there was a question, let me do this and then I'll answer the question. So see, it says A 4 out of 30. That's actors. So you can have 30 actors in a scene, an actor being an interactive object, but you can only have 9 on screen at once before the Game Boy starts chugging a little bit. And that's just like a limitation of the power of a Game Boy. And what that does is it makes you work within like, okay, I'm going to design this screen where, maybe I only have like, X number of enemies on the screen at once. You have to really like control how much content is on the screen at once. Especially when you get to the second number, F for frames, as in frames of animation. You can only, in an entire scene, have 25 frames of animation. Now that doesn't seem quite so bad, except for, let me explain how this works. So you see those bugs there. They each have 6 frames of animation. Now, if I add 2 bugs, like I have, that's still only 6 because it's calling the same image. But if I add another enemy, like a snake, then that's 6 more frames of animation. Suddenly I've eaten 12 frames of animation. And you can see that with the bugs, but also the kudzu plant, like it's in soil on the right, and then the machete, which has a bunch of other frames of animation, which, because that's the thing that the player is going to use to attack, it also has 6 frames. We're already at 22. And, this also assumes like using the player as well. And the player has a bunch of frames of animation. So already we can't have any more enemies, or we'd have to like take something out and add a different enemy, that has fewer frames of animation. So we have a really restrictive number of animations that can be loaded into RAM at one time in the Game Boy. And again, this is why I like using these engines. Because, the problem with all the creativity at your fingertips of Unity is that it's so easy to get lost in infinite possibility. When your possibilities are not infinite, then you have to start making really creative choices, but you come up with like really good solutions. The innovation of retro games like those on Game Boy and NES are insane. It's crazy how much they were able to create with how little they have compared to what we have now. Exactly, and this is actually why we've talked about making it so that the first engine you encounter somewhere, we're trying to figure that out where, is like one of the, like this or Pico 8. Because we want you to get used to making smart design decisions, but then get, if we introduce sky's the limit right away, it kind of breaks your brain into thinking the sky's the limit is the default when it's not. And I've actually joked about, but also kind of not joked about, like having a project be I hand you a 256 megabyte flash drive and be like, your final game project has to fit on that. Because like working within memory limits is a thing. But, and this is not to talk about the Game Boy. The point is that it's to make a very big statement about how games are different and how we manage animation in games. It has a frame limit because that's how many frames of animation you can load into RAM at one time. And actually, there is also a limit on so the way that it does backgrounds in GB Studio is that it just loads it as an image, and then the red lines there are the collisions. But it still reads the background image, and if you have too many unique tiles within the background, it'll reject it won't load your image because that still takes up RAM. So you have to that's why you have big swaths of trees in games like Zelda, is because that actually is just like a few repeating tiles and it just eats up space, and without eating up memory. So it's just like loading in the same number of tiles lots and lots of times. So if we go to the picture on the right, this is the little scene that I use to just like dump stuff. And like I would delete this scene when the game is done. But this is just like if I make a thing but I'm not using it, I'll just tuck it into this cave. So you see already, this is at 17 out of 30 actors. But this is still a one screen space, so this would not load. And then the frames are in the red, 32 over 25. So all of these characters go over the frame limit. And you might think like, wow, that's actually a lot of characters for only going over by, a few, by 7. And in reality, that's because only like 1 or 2 of them can face all 4 directions. Some of them are just like one frame sprites. But you still have to manage your frames. And again, that's why this scene doesn't really exist. It's inaccessible because it's, just my dump for prefabricated items. So how do we manage this? How do we work with this? Because like if you made every frame of animation you wanted ever in your game, and you made this like beautiful, animated, like an animated film, amount of animation for sprites, each of those has to be an image file brought in, and then so that's just going to eat up your memory. And then your game is one of those games that you buy for Switch that requires like a 20 gigabyte download in addition to the thing that's on the card, for those of us who still buy our games physically. So how do we manage animation? The timing we want, but in a small amount of frames. Well, game animation is different because we have 2 ways of controlling our timing. One is how many actual images are in our animation, and the other is playback speed. So in game engines, you control playback speed. And it's not even that it's like good or bad, it's just different to break your brain a little bit to figure out how to work with it. So an example of this is the character that I have this Game Boy game. It has 2 frames of animation. You play it back at 1 speed, it's going to just do like that quick munchie there. But then you play it at a quarter speed, it's right. So we have the ability to do playback speed. And that helps us like get more out of, less frames. And a lot of this, keep in mind, is heavily dependent on your art style. Pixel art the expectations of smoothness are lower, so you can get away with stuff like this. But on the flip side, if we look at feature animation, like Robin Hood here, those numbers, those are the amount of frames. Those are frame numbers. For this walk, it's 65. Oh, 67. I saw a flash there real quick. So it's 67 frames. I mean, well, it's 67 divided by 2 because it's on or I guess 66, so 33 drawings. But, it's on 2s. But that's a lot of drawings. You are not going to load in 33 drawings for a walk cycle in a video. Your game would be undownloadable. So memory management is a big deal. So when we do something like the running bed for Nemo, the running bed is 8 frames. Is it the smoothest, silkiest animation ever? No, but we're not trying to make it that way. We're trying to, basically have beautiful animation, but also walk the line between beautiful animation and this game will fit in a reasonable amount of memory space. So it's a question of when you do animation, how do you have the drawings and the timing and the playback speed work together to produce a satisfactory result? And so in terms of, that's not to say that you throw drawings, the number of drawings, out the window. You still would do slow in, slow out, have more drawings around the keys, like I did with Dr. Pill at the beginning of this. But you have those drawings go perhaps a little further, with a slower playback speed or something like that. So you've heard me talk about when I do my Nemo animations, I'm playing back the animation at 12 frames per second. The reason for that is that on ones, 12 frames per second is 24 frames per second. It's the same timing, because I'm not drawing at 24 frames per second on 2s, which is really just 12 drawings. I'm just making 12 drawings for a second. The difference is that when I render, I'm rendering 12 drawings for a second instead of 24, which would be every drawing, every frame, thus every image that has to go into our Unity project would exist twice. That's a waste of memory. So I render each one only once and I play it at half speed, which again, so I let Unity deal with letting me be on 2s, if that makes sense. So it's about rendering a good amount of drawings to get the animation we want, but also save on memory space. So that's one way it's different, is you're trying to accomplish more with fewer frames so that you can save memory space. And again, the Game Boy example was because I wanted you to see a real super hyper visual example of no, this is a thing that doesn't let you have too many frames, as opposed to me just showing you a download size for a big game or something like that. Because yeah, believe me, memory management is a thing you should learn to practice. And it's something that we talk about having again in the program, because we've gotten for capstones and for other classes, the level design course and things like that, we've gotten single levels that are 20 gigs, and it's just that's wasteful. It's one level just because people load in every mega scan they can find. So it's you want to learn that. You want to understand that memory management is a part of this process, because animation is so resource intensive. The other thing that you need to know about game animation and timing is that the timing has to fit in with inputs, because if you have a game, you need your inputs to feel there's this concept called game feel, which is how responsive does the game feel. I don't like using the term to define the term, but how responsive is the game? And you're playing a game and you're doing the principles of animation and you have anticipation for a punch. If you're playing a fighting game and the character anticipates before a punch too long, because you're using the normal principles of animation, you've broken the game because the anticipation is too long and the game feels slow. So what do? Well, here's you have to almost like break the principles of animation, or at least them from a different perspective. Yes. So here's a tutorial by Pedro Medeiros. He's the pixel artist behind the games Celeste and Towerfall and a bunch of other indie stuff. But if you go on his itch page, he actually has this like pack of tutorial gifts that you can download for like $5. And by paying once, you can download like all the updates. Whenever he comes out with a bunch of new ones, you can get new ones. But they're really great. He sells them as pixel art tutorials, but they're actually really just like game animation tutorials that happen to be in pixel art. So this attack one, for example, is really cool because it covers the concept of like, well, how do you make a responsive attack? Because your choices are, if you want to use anticipation, and I'm thinking of like Simon Belmont in an old Castlevania game, Simon winds up. But when he winds up, they actually like account for that in how, there's collision behind him for that frame where he winds up. So you can actually hit stuff behind you when you're playing Castlevania. Same thing with Link's swing. He swings around in Link to the Past and in Link's Awakening in like the 2D Zelda games. But that swing has like a radius to it, so you actually get like more bang for your buck to account for the animation. Here, what they do is to make a super snappy punch. The first frame is actually the end of the of the hit. It's the hit instead of a wind up. So where it says idle 1, that's like frame 0, and then frame 2 is really frame 1 of the punch. So for Nemo, here's Nemo, we did the same thing, where what you're doing is you're actually doing the principle of animation, the principle of anticipation backwards. You are starting with the end, and then you're emphasizing the recoil to let the brain catch up. So normal anticipation, alert the brain something's happened. This kind of animation makes it happen instantaneously, and then lets the brain catch up. So this is what we did for Nemo, and again, like I based on Medeiros. This is what we did for Nemo, like have a nice response instantaneous hit. Now, attack, as we prototyped it, felt sluggish for a while because at one point the attack was finish the animation before letting anything else, and that made it slug in the standpoint like he winds down super slow. So we had to just say, well, let the player interrupt the animation if they're, running along and then they hit something and then they want to keep running. Don't stop them. Let them just like cancel out the animation and go into the run animation. So it's a you want your game to feel responsive, and you want something like this to happen so that you can attack whatever you're attacking right away, but then you also maybe even want to like program it so that the animation stops and you go into another animation so like the animation doesn't hold you up. So basically the other thing that's different about game animation is that it's all based on user feedback and making your game feel responsive. Is you're going to, maybe not do anticipation. You're going to like let animations, you're just going to cancel animations and go into other ones to make the player keep moving. But that's how you handle animation. That's how you handle movement to make sure it's like it's about the player. It's about creator experience. So that's a big part of this. So I guess before we get moving forward, ask me. I'd like to hear you ask me 2 questions about what we've talked about, or else we're just gonna watch Nemo swat at invisible bats forever. Okay, so yeah, if anybody has questions, I realize I'm creating dead air, but this is better audience interaction. um, don't see flying across the chat. All right. Well, since I have such a long pause, I'm going to keep going. But you will eventually. Okay, here we go. Generally speaking, what's the most popular type of frame timing for games? Could you? I guess could you? I don't understand the question. What do you mean by type of frame timing? I'll try to do my best to answer that one. So you see a lot of games that do have anticipation. I'm not saying games don't have anticipation, but I think for 2D games, like you want to have super instantaneous stuff, but you generally want to have minimal wind up because the most important thing is making the game feel responsive. So if you do have a wind up, you want to make it fairly short unless you're doing something where like they have a big weapon or something like that. But you want to have like the hit be very quick. So you think about Zelda, like you press B and Link will strike very fast. Even in the 3D games. So and yeah, like a lot of it is that the sword swing animation is super short. What you see a lot of actually is that the animation might be short and quick, but then the actual weapon animation is maybe even not attached to the character. We attached it for Nemo just because that's what we wanted to do. We didn't want him to feel like he was like good at sword swinging. He's a 7-year-old kid with a wooden sword, so we didn't want him to feel like Hollow Knight. But if you think about like Hollow Knight, the game Hollow Knight, which also features hand-drawn animation, the knight just kind of like minimally moves his nail, the sword, and there's this big swoopy effect that's added to the character as almost like a post-processing effect. That's a very popular way to do it because it has its own hitbox and it has its own, like, you can change out the effect if you had different swords or something like that. So that's a very popular style, is like the actual character animation itself is minimal, but then you have a special effect laid over it that is the actual swing object. So, and again, it depends on like how well you see the character, but you typically see very quick animations and jumps too. Like, you don't have a lot of wind up for jumps. So jumps are a whole other beast. But generally, it's you want it to be fast for responsiveness. So yeah. When it comes to pixel art animation, do I feel like there is a limitation on how you can animate a character? For pixel art, when you animate a character, I mean, everything depends on the point of view, the style, and the resolution. So it's not that there's like an easy answer to that, but generally the things that you're trying to manage and balance are readability. So again, but this is where, like, even with pixel art, good silhouettes, good motion, arcs, give them a real sense of weight. All of these things can still be accomplished even in, pixel art. And when you're doing limited stuff. So Mega Man is so popular as a sprite to riff on because his silhouettes are really good. So, that's... and his run is actually only 3 frames of animation. They totally cheat with the crossover. There is 1 crossover instead of 2 for each leg, being in front or back, and you don't even notice unless you start analyzing game animation. So it has a different almost set of laws, but it has a lot of the same laws, but because it's pixel art, you can fudge it more. But there's limitations, but you can overcome a lot of them by leaning on your principles. Singles. Oh, okay. So the question was about the type of frame timing. So singles, doubles. Assume in game animation that everything is singles. Everything is animated on ones. It's your frame rate, or not frame rate. It's the playback speed. Frame rate. It's not 30, 60 frame rate. Ignore the frame rate comment. But it's all your timing. Assume you are doing everything on ones, because of if you were to render everything on twos, even if you're playing back, it's like that thing I said with the 12 versus 24. I have my playback speed in Blender set to 12 because it's showing me what my brain perceives as 24 frames per second, but I'm only drawing on ones. But it's playing at half speed, so I am I'm only drawing everything once, or I'm only rendering every drawing once. Does that make sense? Basically, you want to only make every drawing once or you want to render every drawing once instead of rendering it twice to get 24 frames per second, where you'd be animating on twos. So you want to only have to render every drawing once so that you only have 1 copy of everything, and thus half the memory size. So everything's on ones in game animation. And then you just play it back at a different speed. So the next thing is exaggeration. Now, there's this animator, Dante Rinaldi, and his site's been super helpful for some of these principles lectures, but he talks about exaggeration as not a tool in and of itself, but more of a degree to which you apply the other principles of animation. So, we've talked about this with Squash and Stretch. It's based on, like, what is your style, what is the thing you're trying to get across with your animation, that's how much you want to use specific principles. So characters that are rendered semi-realistically, they're going to have less squash and stretch than characters that are, super toony. And that's what exaggeration is how much you want to do stuff. Now, you always want to what's called push the pose. You always want to go further than what it would be like in the real world. Because remember, animation it's not representation, or it's not simulation, it's representation. Meaning that you are not trying to show something as it is, you're trying to show something as the brain will pick it up and accept it. So, a person, like a real person, if you're doing a realistic style animation, a animation that has more realism in the way that characters are rendered, and you say want to make a character seem happy, you would do what's on the left, the slight curve. But no person, when they're happy, goes like, unless they're trying to act like a cartoon, we don't overemphasize motion like that. We'd just be like, we just smile. But you want to really sell the smile. So in a realistic character, you might, have their back arch and have them do this this slight curve to their pose. But as you get cartoonier, you can push this more. You can go and maybe have them jump in the air a little bit with a curve. And then if you really want to have sell this idea, you could have the character jump in the air and have an extreme curve and maybe click their heels or something. And again, I use Beauty and the Beast as an example a lot, but I think that's a movie with characters with different distinct grades of realism, where Belle or Gaston, if they're happy, they're going to be on the left, where Lumiere and Cogsworth and Mrs. Potts, they're going to be all the way on the right here. So you, based on how you're rendering or representing a character, you can exaggerate less or more, but you still exaggerate. So again, if you're doing an animation, and I talked about this in the last class, it's like people say about watching a Rocky movie. Rocky is more fun to watch than boxing because everything is exaggerated and everything is this jaw-crushing left hook, as opposed to when you watch real boxing, where it's a lot of jabs and your focus is on getting more technical wins unless you really can knock a person out. So in a cartoon, if you're really bouncing a tennis ball, it's probably gonna squash and stretch less than we'd animate squash and stretch. If you're drawing a boxer or a golfer, they're going to be drawn with realistic posing like you see on the left here, but on the right is a super cartoony example that's super over exaggerated. But these are examples of if you really want to in animation sell a pose, depending on the style, you always want to do more than the drawings on the left in animation, in all animation. But it's always more than what's on the left, but all the way up to what's on the right. But you always want to emphasize more than you would actually realistically pose. And again, this is where acting things out helps. Is you want to maybe act out and film yourself doing it, and then that can be a good example. So again, here we have Bugs Bunny on the right. That pose would work. It's exaggeration in and of itself that he jumps up in that one particular way. But they even pushed it further by having his head squash and point at the thing that he was surprised by, which is, at this point in the cartoon, I believe, Elmer Fudd going to get an axe. But, his head is stretched, his ears are up, his tail is up. They took that pose, which was already exaggerated, and really cranked it up to 11. And when we looked at the earless dog animation, the confident walk, earlier in the semester, we had the gif of Vince McMahon doing his WWE entrance and doing kind of a silly confident walk, going like this, more confident, more exaggerated than a real human being would do. But again, the cartoon version of that, you with the earless dog that we even looked at last week, would do more like, instead of like this is exaggerating human, he would go like this. So the elbows are higher, the back is arched more. You're pushing the pose. And the reason you want to push the pose, and again, you asked about pixel art animation, push the pose within, your 16 by 24 pixel box or whatever you're animating in. But you always want to push the pose more because it gives you a stronger silhouette and a more readable character, and you understand the intent more. Pushing the pose is also super important when you are doing any character that is not a human character. So Carpet is an example from Aladdin. You also have, the flour sack you were doing. Those characters need exaggeration of the pose because, so like, the equivalent of me in this is like the amount of pose there is not like a human would just go like that, which is a look you could probably sell if you had a human character because you have like the luxury of the eyes and the mouth. But with Carpet, because he has no eyes or mouth, you're pantomiming. So it's like the equivalent of doing that, because you need to really sell that emotion. So exaggeration is super important, especially if you are getting into these like non-human anatomical characters. And again, like, you always want to push the pose. Like that will make the pose more effective. So here is a roar pose that we had with the moon for Little Nemo. And based on Winsor McKay's original drawing of the moon, so we actually had a really great question in the last class, which was, and I thought it was great because the student did a thing that I don't think they realized they were doing, but it was a great example of like how professionals talk to each other. Because, well, let me explain this and then I'll get to why it was a great example. So the question from the student was, why didn't we break the circle outline of the moon? And the answer is because we're working with a few factors. One is that the character, we wanted to emphasize this is the moon. This is a static, heavy celestial body, and he fills the screen. So we didn't want to like, to make him roar, stretch him, or break that circle shape, because he is like the background for the screen he's on, and we didn't want to like make him go over the bounds of the screen just for readability and stuff. The other thing is that because we're working based on a existing thing, intellectual property and things like that, McKay never broke the circle outline of the moon when he would draw the moon character, and we wanted to like do the same thing because we're like working with his style. So the question was, why did we never break that circle? So all this goes into working with the moon and pushing this pose, which is the moon roaring. Now, the version on the left is a little closer to, the moon never roars at Nemo because the moon is like kind of nice, but we wanted to have like, oh, that's a boss in a video game. So we have like a story thing of like why the moon turns kind of mean for the span of roughly one boss fight in our game's story. And so we were like, well, when the moon gets angry and like becomes antagonistic, we want to have it roar, kind of like the some of the monsters in the game Hollow Knight roar at the player. So I drew the one on the left, which is a little more realistic, but also fits McKay a little better. And then I drew the one on the right. Actually, I drew the first one, or the second one before the first one. But I drew the other one I did was the one on the right, which is like a more extreme scream pose, which is not realistic, but like really has more like facial distortion to it. So I shot both images to my team and I said, hey, what do you think? Which one? And I would like to point out, by the way, that me, who's been animating for a long time, I still need gut checks for every once in a while to do stuff like this. And everybody came back preferring the one on the right, saying, push the pose, push the pose. Your one of your other teachers who's on our team, Tim, said, push that pose. So we pushed it. So he's got like total Dragon Ball Z screaming going on. But, you know, so we wanted to push that. And that is the right choice. The one, as I look at the two of them, the more I look at them, I'm like, no. The more screamy one is the more extreme, better one. But your fellow student today, who I thought, again, really insightful question, what she did was by asking, like, why did you make those choices? It was really good because it was like, I can tell you the choices I make and my mindset. You don't have to agree with me. You could be like, I prefer the left one, or I would break the circle of the moon. You don't have to agree with me on the way I did it. But I did it the way I did it, and you might do it a different way. And that's really important because, one, get used to the idea that there are not textbook answers to everything. And this is actually why I wanted to talk about the timing of game animation today, because so many times we've had to break all these rules of animation. We're giving you the rules of animation, but then we're being like, oh, but we skipped half of them because input. But that's important because you need to know that all of these things can be fudged. That's the important part of being an artist, is that there are rules, but often it's also based on your conditions, your creativity, and your decisions as a professional. And what was great about the question is that I pointed out that this is something you'll all need to get used to as professionals. And also, and I pointed out, is like, this is, you know, let's say it's 10 years from now and I'm giving a talk on something like this and you're in the audience. Because, like, ultimately, I'm training you to be my peers, right? Like, you're going to join the industry and then we'll just all be peers. You know, knock on wood. But, you know, the way peers exchange knowledge and ideas is not the way that it's done on, like, the internet, where somebody would be like, that's crap, you did it wrong. It's that, you know, one person asks, why'd you do it this way? The other person gives their reasoning. And then maybe that first person says, oh, that's a good idea, thank you, that's very insightful. Or they might just be like, well, I would have done it that way. And then you start to exchange ideas and points of view on it. And, you know, that's called art appreciation. That's called critique. And it's not bad. It's not that somebody's going to, like, give me an F now. It's like, now we've just exchanged points of view, and that's lovely. But I thought that was really good because it's this process of back and forth that you wanna take part in. That's super rich. But I wanted to bring that up because there was, like, part of this really is, like, you know, again, it's preference, and when I can't offer concrete answers, that's actually because this is an art, it's not a science. And I can say this for reasons that will be very clear in the coming weeks, like, this is an art-based program. You know, it's like, we work with subjectivity. There is heavy doses of subjectivity. It's not objectivity in this. So if you're feeling like, oh no, there isn't a textbook answer for everything, yeah, that's a feature, not a bug. I'm going to keep going, but I would like to hear one question about this. So please ask me a question, especially since that is so style-based. But yeah, ask me a question. I'm going to keep going so that we have all the content down. But the next one is solid design or drawing. Now you're usually going to see this as solid drawing, but there is a artist. It's the artist. What was his name? I forgot his name already. Dante Rinaldi. So Dante Rinaldi from earlier. Again, I mentioned his blog. It's a really good blog. I provided the link in the Discord. But he lumps solid design into solid drawing. And the reason he does that is because when you're doing 3D computer animation, you're often not literally drawing anymore. You model the character once, or unless you need like little tertiary models for some reason, but you're making the character once. The same principles apply. You're just not drawing the character hundreds of times, and so it's a back and forth between, like, for 3D it's solid design, for 2D it's solid drawing. What it amounts to is that the artist, you, must be able to take into account the elements of three-dimensional space in your drawing and your character. So, here we have two pieces of Nemo concept art. Nemo, that character sheet is done by me. Peony was designed by one of your fellow students, Taja Amanis, who joined the Nemo project during the summer internship course. Not this past summer, but the summer before. And, in drawing these characters, we sat down and we said, well, we need to understand their shape construction, so you see those shapes there. But we needed to be able to understand how these characters were shaped so that when we pose them and move them, we can give them a sense of that they exist in three-dimensional space. Even if they are two-dimensional drawings, we need them to move and have, like, when they need to reach an arm across, that arm reaches across realistically. It's not just like, puppet, tacked across or something like that. So the character needs to feel as though it has a realistic volume and weight and mass. You have to understand principles of anatomy. You have to understand three-dimensional shapes. You have to understand balance, weight, light, shadow. So, like, when you draw a pose, it needs to look like the character, unless they are falling, it needs to look like the character could, based on the physics of their body, be in that pose. And if they are supposed to be upright, that they would actually be able to stand upright in that pose. What this amounts to is, can you draw? And this is like, this is the non-software part of this. It's can you draw and model well? And when I say model well, I mean, part of that is, can you use the tool well? But part of that is really like, is the thing you're modeling based on anatomy, based on, and that's not to say everything has to be like, again, a simulation of a perfect human figure. But does the character have a anatomy to them that makes sense, that, like, they would move properly? Do they have elbows that would deform right and things like that? But also, is their design such that, like, they are easily readable? And so I've said, like, I don't grade on quality. Now I'm starting to grade on quality a little bit, but insofar as, like, are you showing improvement between late August and now? Not like, okay, suddenly I pull off suddenly I say, haha, now you all have to be Leonardo da Vinci. That's not true. Or Michelangelo. It's like, are you showing improvement kind of drawing? And that's the idea of, like, drawing is a process of practice. If you haven't had it before this class, you're having it in this class. So I'm grading I'm grading on quality insofar as that. But, ultimately, to be an animator or a game artist, you need to be able to be a good artist. And art is not just using software. it's understanding the principles of anatomy and human life drawing and drawing in general, such that proportions are proper, anatomy is proper, the physical reality of the character is proper. The posing and weight distribution of a character is proper, such that, you know, their poses make sense, and if they were in the poses that you've created for them, they would stand up. Do the poses you make, are they like interesting and not cardboard or flat? Are they, you know, they're not perfectly symmetrical? And again, sometimes you break this and you do have a symmetrical pose for a reason. But, you know, for the most part, are your characters like interestingly posed, and do they have a sense of three-dimensionality to them? You know, here Mickey's like mitten hands are very, and that's not to say I don't use mitten hands, I sometimes do, but, you know, are his hands like here they're very static here, but then in the one on the right his hand is more like this, which is a little more interesting than this. In fact, maybe I'm kind of self-conscious all of a sudden about my Dr. Pill drawing. Maybe I need to go change his hand in the one frame to that instead of that. But, you know, it's how are you posing? How are you modeling these things? Are you making it such that, you know, when you model or when you pose something, does it have a like physical? Are you keeping the physical reality of that character consistent? You know, when you model, and this is like a 9-year-old model, so, you know, and I have a bad habit in 3D modeling, by the way. I'll warn you right now that everything I do is low poly, probably about like a GameCube, PlayStation 2 era, and that's just because I worked in mobile games for so long that like I'm super stingy on polygons, and I need to like not be stingy on polygons. So this is like very low poly character with very simple, it's like also made super quick, so it has very simple textures. But you know, like this character has a physical reality. He's got kind of like a bucket on the bottom, and he's got these like skinny cylindrical arms and legs. But, you know, I couldn't find the animated ones, but I wish I had the animated ones because he reads super duper well when he's posed. He does so sort of like a... If you've ever read H.P. Lovecraft, this is a Innsmouth look character from a game that I made that was like a... What if Tim Burton made a cartoon of the shadow over Innsmouth? So this is my Innsmouth look guy. But, you know, like he's got clear geometrical shapes in him, and, you know, that creates a nice readable character. Same thing here, you know, we've got, and again, here's that low poly, but this was for a game that was like a big top down, like very far up top down, like isometric game. And, you know, the characters have like clear distinct shapes. They are posed in such a way that they are easily readable. The proportions here are based on the proportions of you know, early Walking Dead comics, so Tony Moore style characters. But, you know, you get like, can you construct characters that make some like realistic sense and are readable and legible and things like that? And again, like, I say that not to be like, oh, well, I'm going to do this in 3D and then I never have to worry about, you know, doing it with drawings consistently. Everything that is good about 3D, when you look at good 3D studios, they're basing all of the knowledge of how they render characters and design characters and everything. All of these principles come from 2D. That's why you're practicing 2D. You know, you don't get a get out of jail free card once you go back to Maya. We still hold you to these principles. It's just that you do them in 2D instead of 3D instead of 2D. And, you know, it's like I was asked in the last class, and I've been asked before, you know, would you use an X sheet when you do 3D animation? Well, you're not marking where you're going to do your drawings, but you're still plotting out your timing. And it's a timing planning tool. So, you know, you see it most commonly in 2D, but I've had people, I've enforced using it in 3D on projects, and I've had students do it. And I had a class where I taught the 3D students how to do X sheets, and the ones that did it for their project had better animations. Like, all of them that did it had better animations than the one that didn't do it, because their animations were more finished because they took the time to plan, and that made their actual production go faster. But they also, again, were planful and like really stopped to think about it instead of just like diving in and making something. But all of this 3D stuff is based on 2D. So, you've got to still be really good at drawing. Being good at drawing in 2D makes you better at 3D. It makes you a better 3D modeler. So all of this stuff about like being good at art, solid modeling, things, solid drawing, things like that, it's across all animation media. So you want to, practice that draftspersonship, because that will also help you in your 3D as well. And again, like, this is not to say that you're supposed to make everything super hyper realistic. Here we have the character from the animated short Waddle, which is one of your case studies, but still solid modeling, still has balance, still has weight. He's top heavy, but that's part of the gag, but he's still readable and legible. And I'm just going to finish up and then I'll take questions. But the last thing that I want to talk about, the last principle, is called appeal. And appeal is the equivalent of charisma in actors. So basically, the question you ask yourself is, does the audience accept the reality of my character? And do they find the character interesting? Can they read the character? Now, we're getting some bleed over with other things. But I have Flip here. And I do this not as a flex. It's going to sound like I'm flexing. I'm not flexing. But, when we show people our game, I've been told this. Our Flip reads better than McKay's Flip. Now, again, I say that not to flex on McKay, because he's like one of the fathers of American animation. The reason I say this is because we are making this character with the benefit of almost a century of knowledge of animation that includes the knowledge of how to make appeal. So appeal is something that it sounds like it's really hard to do. And actually, there's a lot of drawings of Flip that do have enormous appeal. I just chose this one because I thought this one was a little stodgier in terms of like his silhouette and stuff, even though I do like this design a lot. But there are tricks that you can use to make appeal. It sounds like well, how the heck am I going to give a drawing charisma? It sounds like a soft skill, but there's things we can do. By the way, credit to Megan Smith for designing an awesome version of Flip. She's another one of your Kent State colleagues, but again, also joined us for the internship class to do concept art for Nemo a few years ago. So part of appeal is silhouette. Part of it's, can your character be instantly recognizable in like when you black out their design, and can you understand who they are? So characters with good silhouettes are more appealing, but the other thing is like, does their personality shine through? So some of this is in the acting that you do. So here we have cover art for my game La Mancha. And the first cover art I had was just a picture from one of the cards, a recreation of the famous windmill scene from Don Quixote. And people liked it. They were like, oh, cool, yeah, Don Quixote game. But people really, and that was even my cover art on Kickstarter. When I made this painting and put this as the cover art on Kickstarter, I started getting more hits and more, in the middle of the campaign. The beginning of the campaign is always your like gold rush. It's like the beginning and the end. But when I had this, I got more random people clicking because you had character appeal. selling it instead of just like a cool action scene. So, you know, Sancho is kind of like, he's got a sort of, I don't want to be in in danger, but he's got, you know, it emphasizes his design more because you're closer up. Don Quixote's sort of over the top guy cosplaying chivalry with like lots of over the top flourishes. It reads in this character right here. So, you know, having that personality come through is really helpful. And then the other thing about and you can see him here, like Don Quixote and Sancho in particular. Don Quixote is very tall and lanky, but then his face is kind of a triangle. It's like very pointy with the beard and the mustache. Sancho is very round, and we've talked about this before. Giving characters a clear shape theme is a very good way to create appeal. You know, the easiest thing to do with appeal is make characters very cute and very round. That's not to say all characters have to be cute and round, but, you know, giving them a good shape base tells you about who the character is and describes, like, lets you understand, makes them more interesting and, like, instantly more, I'm trying not to use the word appealing, you know, charismatic or like more cool, basically. You know, if they were not instantly appealing and they did not have a sort of clarity of understanding who they are, then your characters are not going to be as interesting and the audience won't get as attached to them. So, you know, this shape theory of character design is an important part of appeal. And again, this is all the stuff that we put into Flip. He is very round, but his body has kind of a triangle thing to it. And, you know, he's a really interesting character that people tend to like a lot. And, you know, because again, we kind of took the elements of McKay that started to hint at appeal and we like emphasized them more. There's more exaggeration. And then, you know, an oldie but a goodie, my game Swarm from many, many years ago, you know, same thing kind of happened. Like, I was asked to like make a bunch of sketches of possible characters for this game idea we had. It was the rolling ball platform game where you ran from swarms of enemies. So it was like, well, what could a rolling ball be? And it was like, well, it could be this character with like this edgy character with a face that he's like, he likes to go fast. Give him some like Sonic the Hedgehog overtones. So like maybe we have that. Maybe he's just a cue ball that's like super happy anime cue ball guy. Maybe it's a hamster in a ball, you know? So we thought of all these different things and they really liked the idea of this character with, you know, the round ball thing, the attitude, you know, they thought the character had good appeal, and then he evolved over time, his proportions evolved over time, but you can see how that appeal was a really central part of him. You know, and again, people like it. My kids fan art this character, which is neat, so apparently we did something right. And it got me the job to work on the game. So, you know, appeal is, you want to work that personality. You want, and again, this is part of like why you do attitude poses and strong silhouettes, is because you want to communicate through your design, not just like, oh, your design is detailed and is cool. You want to, through the body motion, through the language, through the expressions, communicate who that character is. Because if you can communicate personality, that's way more interesting than, you know, and again, like, don't just have them like, oh, they're happy-go-lucky. No. You want to have, you know, that kind of stuff. And that's, you know, sometimes it's a little overdone in movie posters where every character is going, looking at you, Frozen poster. But, you know, it works and people like it. So, you know, appeal is, it, you know, I'm making fun of the movie posters, using appeal on movie posters a little bit. But it is an important part of character design, and it is an important part of selling people on your idea. Because again, having characters like working the appeal can be the difference between which character to use or not. It can be the difference between whether you get hired for the job or not, and it can be the difference between whether people give Kickstarter money to the thing or not. So, yeah, I don't know. That's it. Any questions? Yes, every DreamWorks poster. That's a really good. Yes. I mean, really, every cartoon movie poster for the last 10 years, to the point of is it DreamWorks that makes Hotel Transylvania? Whoever makes Hotel Transylvania, I don't like those posters at all. I think the posters undersell the appeal of those characters a lot because they don't do it right. They're trying to do Tartakovsky, whatever, the Dexter Lab Powerpuff Girls director. He's the one who is managing that he's the one directing those movies and managing that art style. And when you watch those movies, they're gorgeous, but they don't add any of that posing in the posters, and Dracula's just I'm probably even overselling it, so it looks like the movie 40-Year-Old Virgin, but Dracula's just and it's not any of the zany wackiness and distinctiveness of the way that the character actually moves in the movie. So they don't emphasize his poses at all. Are there any internships opportunities with Kent except working in 3D? You mentioned students worked on Little Nemo. So we have every summer, if you have, we run an internship class, and the class is basically if you either can hook something up on your own, and we've had students certainly do that. They find a company that they can be an intern for. We had a student last summer actually help develop a pitch for Netflix from a local children's author that she got in touch with Netflix, and they were going to do a pitch for her book to be turned into an animated series. But so he got to work on that. So people either find their own, or if faculty have ongoing creative projects that that they need help with, we are allowed to have students work on that as an internship opportunity, which is great for us because then it actually puts pressure on us to make our thing happen so that it can be on your portfolio. Otherwise, you're just kind of helping us spin all our wheels. So yeah, we do offer opportunities for students to join projects by faculty, or even other parts of the university, but we haven't had anybody approach us for that yet. So yes, short answer, yes. Long answer, that's how it works. And then usually what we do for that is we will put out a call for applications, and we actually treat it like a formal application process. Both, A, to see the work, and B, to give you practice at applying for jobs, because we just ask you to basically prep all the stuff that you'd have to have anyway to apply for a job. Cool. Awesome. Well, I'm around for questions in Discord if anybody has any other burning questions. But other than that, I'll talk to you all later. Have a great week. Bye.